All right, diving right in. Today we're tackling something super practical, something every web developer, every budding coder out there has probably dealt with. Getting data from a form into a database. Sounds simple enough, right?
It is in principle, but there's a huge GE but
Yeah.
that often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
Security. And that's where PHP PDO comes in. It's like the unsung hero of secure web forms.
Okay, so PHP PDO, for those who are maybe just starting out, break that down for us a bit. What is it and why should we care about it, especially in the context of forms and databases?
So PDO stands for PHP Data Objects. It's a way for your PHP code to talk to databases in a standardized and crucially more secure way. Think of it like this. You wouldn't send sensitive information on a postcard, right? You'd want it in an envelope.
You're really into the whole secure envelope analogy today, but I get it. You're saying that PDO is like that extra layer of protection for data. It's not just about getting the information there, it's about getting it there safely.
Exactly. And a big part of that security comes from something called prepared statements. This is where PDO really shines. Imagine you're telling the database, hey, I'm sending you some data. It's going to be a name, a class, maybe some marks. Be ready for it.
Okay, so we're giving the database a heads up. It's like saying, expect a package, but I'll give you the details later. It's not just a free-for-all of information just getting dumped in there.
Exactly. And because you're telling the database what to expect, what type of data is coming in, it's much harder for malicious code to sneak in. We're talking about preventing SQL injection attacks, which, believe me, are not something you want to mess with.
SQL injection, that sounds scary. So we're giving the database this heads up, this blueprint of what to expect using PDO. But how do we actually tell it, okay, this is the name, this is the class, fill in the blanks?
That's where bind param comes in. It's like attaching that label to our secure package. Our source code gives a great example using a student database table. We've got placeholders. Think of them like variables, things like .name, .class, .mark.
Right, I'm looking at the code snippet now, and it makes more sense seeing it visually. So we're basically saying, hey, database, see that placeholder.name. I'm going to give you the actual name to put there in a second, but keep it safe. Okay.
Exactly. You're not just throwing raw data at the database and hoping for the best. It's controlled, it's secure. And that's what makes PDO so powerful, especially when you're dealing with sensitive information like student data.
You know, it's funny because it seems like such a small thing, this whole prepared statement and bind parent business. But when you think about the potential consequences of not doing it, of having your database exposed.
Oh, it's not small at all.
Yeah.
We hear about data breaches all the time, and often it boils down to not taking these basic security measures. PDO makes it easy to do things right.
Right. Nobody wants to be on the receiving end of one of those news stories. Okay, so we've got our form data packaged up securely, delivered to the database. We're feeling good. But what happens next? Does PDO just wash its hands of the whole thing? Data's there, not my problem.
Not quite. PDO has a few more tricks up its sleeve, things that make it even more powerful for web development. One of these is the concept of last inserted.
Last inserted. Okay, now you're just using code words to sound cool. Break it down for us. What is that?
All right. Think of it like this. Every time you add a new student to your database, imagine they get assigned a unique digital fingerprint. That's essentially what last inserted gives you. It's a way to immediately reference that newly added record.
A digital fingerprint. I like that analogy. So it's not just about storing the data. It's about being able to instantly identify and work with it. But why is that so important? Give me a real-world scenario where this last inserted thing would be a lifesaver.
Let's say you're generating student ID cards automatically after registration. Instead of hunting through the database for that new student's record, you can use last inserted to instantly grab it and link it to their shiny new ID card.
So it's like the moment their name hits the database, boom, they exist, they've got an ID, they're officially in the system. That's efficient and probably saves a ton of headaches for whoever's in charge of making those ID cards.
Exactly. And speaking of making things easier, our source code also highlights how PDO can handle errors. And this, again, might seem like a small detail, but it's huge for user experience.
Okay, error handling. We've all seen those generic something went wrong messages online, not exactly helpful, right? What makes PDO's approach to error handling stand out? What are we doing differently?
Imagine your parent filling out this registration form and you accidentally typed the wrong birth date for your child. Instead of just getting a cryptic error message, what if the form told you, hey, that birth date doesn't look quite right. Can you double check?
Okay, yeah, that's a lot more helpful than wanting to hurl my computer across the room because I have no idea what went wrong. So, PDO not only helps us prevent errors with secure data handling, but it also helps us handle those errors gracefully when they do pop up, which, let's be honest, they always do.
Exactly. And that attention to detail, both on the back end with security and on the front end with user experience, that's the mark of a well-built application. And it all starts with understanding the power of PDO. Now, before we move on to even more exciting things that PDO can do, there's one more gem in this code I want to point out.
So error handling, even that gets a makeover with PDO, making our applications more user-friendly. But let's talk about scaling things up. We've got this student database, names, classes, maybe even those digital fingerprints you mentioned earlier. What happens when our school database starts to grow? We can't just keep cramming everything into one giant table, can we?
You're right, things can get a bit unwieldy with a single massive table. That's where the elegance of relational databases comes in. Think about a library. You wouldn't put every single book on one giant shelf, right?
Oh my goodness, no. That's my nightmare. Chaos. I need fiction, nonfiction, maybe a self-help section. For those days when the code just isn't cooperating.
Exactly. You want things organized, categorized, and that's what relational databases allow you to do with your data. Instead of one massive table, you have multiple tables that are related to each other.
Okay, so in our school scenario, we might have a table for students, a table for teachers, a table for classes, and so on. But how do we actually connect the dots between these tables? How do we say, hey, this student belongs to that class?
That's where foreign keys come into play. It's like adding a special label to each book in our library analogy. This label doesn't contain every detail about the book, just a unique identifier that links it to a specific shelf or category.
Okay, so instead of cramming every detail about a student, including their entire class schedule, into the student table, we use this foreign key to create a link. So it's like a pointer saying more info over there.
Precisely. And this approach has two major advantages. First, it keeps your database lean and efficient. You're not repeating information unnecessarily. And second, it allows for incredibly powerful queries and data retrieval.
Queries, data retrieval sounds a bit technical. Can you give me a real-world example of how this would work in our school database?
Absolutely. Let's say you need to contact all the students in Mrs. Johnson's 10th grade math class. Instead of manually going through every student record, you can use the foreign key that links students to their classes.
So we can say, show me all the students whose class I matches the ID for Mrs. Johnson's math class, and boom, we've got our list. That's way faster than scrolling through a spreadsheet.
Exactly. It's like having a superpowered search engine for your school data, all thanks to foreign keys.
Okay, that is pretty slick.
Yeah.
But with all these interconnected tables and data flowing between them, what about security? We don't want to create vulnerabilities just by organizing our database this way.
That's a crucial point. But luckily, the same PDO security principles we discussed earlier still apply. We're still using prepared statements and parameterized queries to ensure that every interaction with our database is secure, even when we're dealing with multiple tables.
So it's like we're building a fortress around our data, brick by secure brick, no matter how complex our database structure gets. That's reassuring to hear, especially with something as important as student data.
Absolutely. And speaking of keeping our data safe and sound, our source material also touches on another crucial concept: transactions. You see?
Transactions, okay, that sounds intriguing. Almost like we're talking about financial records now. What are transactions in the context of databases, and why should we care?
Good catch.
Yeah.
It's easy to think of financial transactions, but in databases, it's a bit different. Imagine you're at the library and you want to check out 3 books. You wouldn't want to be stuck with just 1 or 2 if something went wrong, right?
Oh no, that's the worst, especially if it's the last copy of a really good book. So are transactions like a safety net for our data?
Exactly. A transaction groups, a set of database operations together. It's like saying either all of these things happen or none of them do. It ensures that your data stays consistent and reliable.
Okay, so if one part of the operation fails, the whole thing rolls back, like hitting the undo button. That makes sense. It's like having a safety net for those uh-oh moments. Can you give me a real-world example of how transactions might play out in our school database?
Imagine you're transferring a student from one class to another. You need to update their record in the student's table. And make changes to the class roster. With a transaction, either both of those changes go through or neither of them does.
That's huge, because if something went wrong halfway through, you could end up with a student listed in 2 classes, or even worse, no class at all. And nobody wants that kind of chaos, especially not on the first day of school.
Right. Transactions help prevent those kinds of inconsistencies that can lead to headaches down the road. It's all about ensuring that our data stays accurate and reliable no matter what changes we make.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly robust toolbox now. PDO secure inserts, organized data with foreign keys, error handling, and now transactions to keep everything running smoothly. What haven't we talked about yet? What other PDO magic do we need to unleash on the world?
Well, we've talked about how to insert data securely, but what about retrieving it? That's where PDO's select statement comes into play. Think of it as the key to unlocking all that valuable information stored in your database.
Select. Right, because what good is having all this data if we can't actually access it and use it? So select is how we get the information we need from our database.
Exactly. It allows you to specify exactly what data you want to retrieve and how you want it organized. It's like having a powerful search tool for your database.
I'm starting to feel like a data detective. So let's say we want to generate a list of all students, alphabetically ordered. How would we do that with PDO's select statement?
Our query would look something like this. Select from students, order by last name ASC. We're basically saying select all columns from the students table and order the results by the last name column in ascending order, ASC.
Okay, so we're telling the database exactly what we want and how we want it organized. What if we only need specific information, not the entire student record? Can we be picky?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's say you only need the student names and emails. Your query would be select first name, last name, email from students, specifying just those columns. No need to overload ourselves with information we don't need at that moment.
I like it. Efficient and elegant, just like a well-organized library. Now, I remember we talked about security being super important, especially with user input. Does that apply here, even with retrieving data using Select?
Absolutely. Especially when you're taking user input, say, through a search bar to build your select queries.
Yeah.
You always have to be wary of SQL injection vulnerabilities.
Right, like that villain sneaking in through the back door. So even though we're just grabbing information, we still need to be incredibly careful about how we craft those select statements.
Precisely. Always sanitize user input and use parameterized queries with PDO to keep those pesky SQL injection attacks at bay.
It's like having a bodyguard for our data, no matter where it's going. Okay, so we've retrieved our data securely, maybe even in a nice sorted list. What's the final step? What do we actually do with this information once we have it?
That's where you, as a developer, get to be creative. PDO gives you the raw ingredients, but how you present them is up to you. You can use PHP to loop through the results of your query and display the data however you like.
I'm picturing well-organized tables, maybe some charts and graphs to visualize student demographics. We're talking next-level school administration here.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of working with databases in PDO. It empowers you to not just manage data behind the scenes, but to also present it in a way that's insightful and even visually appealing.
We've covered a lot of ground in this PDO deep dive, from secure inserts to foreign keys, error handling, transactions, and now even retrieving and presenting data. It's been quite a journey. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners before we wrap up this episode?
Remember, PDO provides the tools, you provide the vision. Don't be afraid to explore, experiment, and always, always prioritize security.
Wise words. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of PHP PDO. We hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as we have. Until next time, happy coding.